So good afternoon. Welcome to another webinar. This is one of our series of webinars that we have been conducting for PwC network. It is an opportunity for us to share our experiences and our ideas and what kind of trouble and what kind of issues we have been facing when we are implementing different regulatory requirements as they have been released by a number of documents and guidelines. And it is very important to note that none of the institutions on its own can possibly find all the relevant details, so an exchange is here ultimately important to have a better understanding. We have today also a number of valuable colleagues, and they are in their own very area also experts. In terms of risk modeling, I have my colleague Luis, who is from Portugal. He's an ex-regulator, so has also a very distinctive view from the regulatory perspective. Then we have Jose, who's a director in the risk and regulatory department. And then my team colleague Robert is as well available today. We will start briefly with a general view, then we will move on to specific aspects of the ECB guidelines as well as the draft document that has been released about the CCF model development. And there are basically two regulatory reference material we will be focusing on today. And the first one would be the guideline, and secondly, the CCF draft document, discussion documents released by EBA. These are recently released and containing a number of updates and in line with expectations from the industry, obviously. The EBA guideline specifically discusses the methodological aspects of estimating CCF within the context of IRB framework. This obviously builds upon existing work in guidelines for PD and LGD and features as well several new aspects related to facility level definition of CCF, related to modeling window of 12 months from the moment of, before the moment of actual default. Obviously, this was followed up later in the same month by the guideline that has been released by ECB, as we generally call it EGIM, internal model guideline, which is a key document for us as all inspection teams, whenever we submit or resubmit models, looking up to this material for their respective inspection work. Whenever such work is required to approve the models and to make them part and parcel of risk-weighted asset calculation, which eventually end up in the assessment of capital required. It's essential for many banks to fully understand all the significant changes described in these two very relevant documents and plan effectively. We do believe especially the CCF relevant guideline will have a significant impact on the industry because of two very relevant features that has been posing us. One of them is obviously the understanding of what the CCF RDS, the reference data set should be, and how we want to basically identify the relevant corresponding data set with respect to LGD as well. We want here today give you an overview of the most relevant changes that will affect the IRB framework, along with all other proposed actions that might be needed down the road. We have structured the changes as such. We will first cover the general topics. That would be practically Luis and Jose, and this will focus on PD and LGD model relevant regulatory changes, and then we'll come down to revised CCF requirements and discuss the aspects of the EBA consultation paper. We would like to encourage you to ask us questions, to exchange with us your comments. And for that, on the right edge, on the upper lower part of your screen, WebEx screen, there is a button called chat, and you can use that easily to share with us your questions that we will want to address during the presentation. And if it's a long question and requires a lot of time, we will have at the end of this discussion today a 30-minute Q&A session. And during this Q&A session, we would like to go through the questions that you will share with us. Luis, please.
Thank you, Ken. So now looking to the ECB guide on internal model. So as Ken said, so it was a very recent publication. It was made in July. It basically tried to bring what were the needed adaptations due to the publication and the entry into force of the CR3, but it also reflected the experience that ECB is gaining in the last years. And to be honest, since 2019, probably this was the most impactful list of changes that were now introduced. So many of the changes, they were somehow anticipated by the industry, because we attended several industry roundtables, and we saw the ECB sharing their views in the end of 2024. And many of the points that were raised by that moment, they were fully accommodated in this revision of the guide. So topics surrounding governance validation and also machine learning, they were fully incorporated. And regarding particularly the topic of machine learning, please bear in mind that we are not going to cover this topic today, but we'll have a dedicated webinar where we'll try also to bring the most practical side of the usage of machine learning and how this can be seen in the context of the IRB models. Beyond this, it's very important to note that ECB made clear reference to the supervisory handbook published by EBA in 2023 regarding the validation and audit processes. So it also tried to make the connection with this publication. And we have also more technical topics that were here adapted, and we have them listed on the right side of the slide. I'm going just to pinpoint some of the changes because we have some details on these topics later on. Basically, in terms of data governance, what we have here is clearly the ECB sponsoring not only the BCBS 239 standards, but also DORA requirements. Basically, sound data governance, data management, and data security processes, they need to be in line with BCBS 239 for all data inputs that are used in the model. And that's basically the golden rule that is put forward by the ECB. In terms of DORA, well, the ECB is stating that banks should monitor data security and have a timely reaction when there are breaches in terms of handling their own data. And basically, DORA is also being brought into the equation when it comes to IRB rating systems. In terms of the model risk management, so what we have here in one hand is a clear focus on the training programs and training programs for all stakeholders, including top management. So clearly the ECB stating that the accountability and responsibility of the top management should also be reinforced by their increased awareness and knowledge and expertise when it comes to assessing also the performance and trying to understand how model risk is being managed. The second part regards complexity. So how complexity needs to be assessed regarding each internal model. And this topic is very important because complexity is one of the key dimensions when sizing model risk. And connected with model risk, we also have the materiality of the models. And that leads me to the following topic regarding how materiality should be considered in terms of internal validation. And in this regard, the ECB clearly states that all the procedures, the methods, the tests should be in line with the materiality of each rating system. Indeed, it needs to be tested, it needs to be confirmed. And those that are material, they need to be subject to a more frequent scrutinize, more intense in terms indeed of the tests that need to be run. And in this regard, even the material ones, they need to be subject to a full validation every 3 years at least. So basically, a much more conservative approach when it comes to the most material models. And that is clear when addressing the topics of internal validation. Regarding internal audit, what we see here from DCB is basically the need for banks to document the responsibilities of the 3 lines of control when it comes to the use of internal models. And in particular, in terms of internal audit, it's very important to make it clear the borders when it comes to assess, for instance, definition of default, the IT implementation of the rating systems, the assignment of exposures to exposure classes, all those topics, they need to be clearly stated who is responsible for what. And in this regard, internal audit should play a role that needs to be clear to everybody. In terms of definition of default, we don't have here major changes. We have 2 very specific notes. One regards the days past due criteria, where the ECB tries to be more clear, or at least to make it more transparent to everybody, its ideas regarding the counting of the days, and in particular, what kind of amounts should be considered, focusing here, for instance, on maintenance costs that are connected with deposit accounts that were not used, and therefore those maintenance costs or fees that were applied. Also, how to treat written off amounts. So all those details, they were here considered in this very specific part. The other topic here within the DoD is the UTP, and the importance for banks to reinforce the set of UTPs that are being considered. And the example that is provided here is in case of asset-based lending, how the value and the marketability of the asset that is being funded is indeed being assessed, and that could be perceived trigger for UTP. And that's basically, I will say, the most relevant other changes that were introduced here by the ECB. Now moving forward and try here to do a little bit deep dive on 3 or 4 topics. So now moving to PPU and rollout. So basically there is, as we all know, a major change on the CR3. So banks do not need to apply IRB for the entire banking group. This is not mandatory. They need to do it at exposure class level. And basically we have 2 options. Either we apply the IRB for all the exposures. If that is not the case, then we need to have PPU for the remaining ones, staying at the standardized approach, or we are under the standardized approach and therefore no IRB rules will be applied. This means that the 50% IRB coverage requirement, both in AED and risk-weighted assets, is no longer applicable. It lost its relevance. We don't have from the ECB any kind of minimum reference within each exposure class of what should be the minimum coverage. I mean, informally, we have seen discussions close to ECB teams talking about 50%, 20%, but that is not formal. And indeed, EBA is mandated by the CR3 to really set how the materially linked to slices of exposure within each exposure class should be quantified, and indeed to define any kind of minimum threshold. So the ECB has not done it, and we have the EBA mandated to do it by July 2028. So this is something that in the meantime, as we discussed with the ECB teams, there are no formal rules, but we need to justify what could be potentially the maximum share of immaterial exposures, either in terms of, for instance, foreign branches or in terms of very different product types. Another topic here that is relevant is that institutions really need to define internal criteria to defend what is their strategy in terms of the application scope, in terms of the rollout sequence, and of course in terms of what will be the exposures under the PPU conditions. And those criteria, they need to be set at group level, and it should be part of this internal model strategy. When defining this strategy, you need to consider what is the required operational capacity, what will be the cost of developing rating systems to cover another set of exposures of type of products. And we also need to consider the different institutions within the banking group, if they are strategic, non-strategic, and of course, the scale of their activities. At the end of the day, also data needs to be representative and needs to be available to be used on the modeling processes. So institutions that indeed tend to be compliant, they really need to be clear and have a streamlined approach at group level. That requires from the banks, of course, to bring all the strategic decisions on top of any action. They need to very, very clearly develop very objective and intuitive criteria to define what will be the approach and what will be the rationale behind any kind of exclusions from the IRB, either under foundation or really in terms of the application of the standardized approach. And that's a very important topic because banks continue to discuss what will be the final landscape in terms of IRB coverage. What you have here in this slide is basically the set of criteria that I've just listed and how banks need to consider them one by one. Of course, the impact on risk-weighted assets is always a very important topic. It should not lead the decision based on what will be a potential reduction of risk-weighted assets. Indeed, ECB will be very attentive to this dimension. In terms of representativeness of the data, as you all know, the standards today for model development, they are more conservative and more demanding than ever. So representativeness needs to be checked over multiple dimensions. And all the capabilities that any operation should hold and the costs they need to bear to develop a compliant rating system is also a very important dimension to be considered. So at the end, what banks need to understand is from a cost-benefit analysis and also look into the calculation of risk-weighted assets under the different approaches, how they can really support the future applications in terms of their rating systems. A very specific note that is also listed here in the slide is that whenever you have IRB models that indeed stop being IRB, we need to consider that the IRB outcomes, they are still useful for multiple purposes. If they are no longer IRB approved, you still need to consider what we are going to do under IFRS 9 under Pillar 2, which means economic capital calculations, and also for pricing, when you attempt to understand what could be, for instance, the cost of capital, especially if you look in this from economic perspective. So very important for you to decide how you really need to continue on the backstage working with these models and probably start developing non-IRB models with impacts on decision, but also on performance assessment from a risk-based perspective. Now moving to the next slide. So very important change here from a formal perspective. So we see the ECB stating very clearly that the top management body and senior management, they are accountable and responsible for a timely submission of the applications. So they need to somehow to honor their compromises with credible submissions for model changes or extensions or even for new applications. And they need to do this on proper conditions. And proper conditions mean that internal control functions, they did their work and we don't have any material incompliance with the regulation, or we don't have a relevant or material number of deficiencies that were not remediated prior to the submission. This appeals to, of course, a reinforced acting from all the control lines of defense and the conscience from the top management that indeed these lines of control, they need to work independently with sound criteria, and of course at the end of the day it's up to them to decide either if there are conditions or not for the submission. The last point is a very, very curious topic, which means if you decide to stay for instance, the foundation, IRB, you are still being requested by the ECB to continue to calculate the long-run averages for LGDs and CCFs, so that you are always capable of comparing realized values with the regulatory ones that you are applying. And this is a very important point because it requires from you to continue your efforts in reinforcing our modeling capabilities, trying to understand exactly what could be the potential difference. We don't know yet what is going to happen in the future, what ECB is going to do with this information, but it will allow you, in one hand, to continue supporting, for instance, the go back to foundation. In the other hand, it has a confirmation regarding what could be the differences between regulatory values and your own internal estimates. And now I'll hand over the word to José. Please, José.
Hi, everyone. So in these next slides, we'll focus on what is new from expectations regarding both PD and LGDs. I will start by PDs, focusing on what is the likely range of variability, what is the revised expectations regarding what this framework should look like. So starting by the mix between good and bad years. If in the past there were some lights about what are the expectations regarding having some good balance between good and bad years, at this point, I think the slides disappeared again when we changed the owner. maybe the question is this. I think this already overcome, so simple solution for big problem. Okay, done. So going back to the original idea. So if in the past we already knew that we need to do some kind of an analysis to provide comfort to the ECB that we had a good balance between good and bad years for the observation period that is feeding the long run average calculation, now we have more light on what is intended with this analysis. And on top of that, the analytical effort is increasing. So room for expert judgment is clearly reducing. So there is now almost a mathematical approach, if can be the wording for this, for us to derive what is this mix. So clear expectation regarding the last 20 years to do such an analysis. Based on this analysis, we need to relate what is internal delinquency frequency with what is economic indicators. These economic indicators somehow need to have a clear relationship that needs to be confirmed via correlation analysis. And in that sense, what are the potential reactions from banks in this regard is to do a gap between what is current frameworks, fully understand what are the fragilities that we have in place on the current outlook of such frameworks, and start immediately trying to revise to see if somehow these different expectations will trigger the need to revise what is the long run average. In that sense, all the risk quantification process will be impacted by such conclusions. A new, already not so new in the sense that, as Luis told before, in the roundtables, ECB already expressed his idea of having a clear reference value to benchmark results from the long run against a fixed time window. This fixed time window, it's now clear for everyone that will cover the years of 2008 until December 2018, having in mind that performance window shall go until 2019. Rules are clear how to derive this reference value, and should be stated also that in the case where internal data is not available, institutions are basically demanded to apply techniques, or either via pool data or via extrapolation techniques, to cover all the years needed to do the comparison with the reference value. So going a bit on detail regarding this framework, what are the key points? So in one side, the historical observation period. From the guidelines, we already knew, but now it is clear also in ECB expectations that the last 5 years of data should be considered to start the observation period, being increased by each year until we find the so-called mix of good and bad years. The variability analysis, once more, should be based on assessing the relationship between what is the internal default rates vis-a-vis what are the economic indicators, being relevant to state that economic indicators should be selected based on the type of exposure that are being subject to analysis. In that sense, what we typically have been seeing is a great convergence between what these economic indicators are for PDs as provided for LGDs, in the sense that for LGDs, calibration for downturn conditions is clear what are the expectations of supervisors in terms of which indicators should be considered, and in that sense makes logic that there is a holistic view on how economic indicators are influencing macroeconomic decisions on the different risk parameters. On top of that, it's a new added comment in terms of the analysis of the economic indicators, that also lag effects should be considered. So whenever we go to the correlation analysis to see if the macroeconomic environment somehow can explain what we are observing in internal default rates, lag effects should be considered. Whenever such correlations do not provide any meaningful results, it's relevant that institutions select an observation period that should include both the worst case scenario, but also the, let's say, best scenario in historical observation period. In that sense, if correlation exists, what is then the expectation? That the framework that is developed by institutions has a clear definition what is a good and bad year. Once applied the definition, the institution should understand what is the expected share of bad years based on the last 20 years of information, ensure that the observation period selected for the long run average does match such share, and lastly, confirm that the 1 year default rate that returns the highest value is contained on the observation period. In the case that this is not possible to prove, institutions should provide further explanations on why such peak is not covered in the observation period. Regarding the reference value, please note that what is being bringing as new. For one side, the reference value has a clear expectation in terms of the granularity in which should be computed, meaning the reference value comparison should occur at calibration segment level. In that sense, institutions should be very strategic in the way that they place their calibration stages to make sure that whenever they are defining the long run average and they are making all the comparisons and make sure that the observation period is correct, they are doing it at that same level. In terms of technical specifications, to derive this reference value in terms of methodological background, it's not different than deriving a long run average. The only difference is the fixed time window of 2008 to 2018 once more, and it's relevant to state that if there is incomplete data to be able to derive such period, once more extrapolation techniques are expected by ECB to be able to fully comply with the time window settled for the reference value. Of course, in the case where the reference value stays above the long run average, it is expectation that the ECB understands why is it above. And in this sense, I would say that main challenge, at least from our recent experience, is not only to explain why years prior to 2010, which is much of the cases that we see in the industry, a lot of banks trying to defend, at least in countries where the downturn conditions were more severe in the European debt crisis, so trying to defend that the cutoff should be in 2010. And in that sense, it's not so much of discussing why to cut 2008 and 2009, but also to justify why to maintain the years after 2018, which typically are characterized by lower default rates. So both topics are relevant, both have impacts on what is the perception of representativeness that the bank has in terms of that data. Data that is far away, maybe quite distinct in terms of what is the current outlook of the credit underwriting standards, and data that is now earlier, maybe quite relevant in terms of what is the strategy of the bank in terms of risk appetite, and also what is the supervisory pressure that today exists in originating new business. So going forward, now focusing in the LGDs, please note that for LGDs, majority of the inclusions in the ECB focus a lot in the downturn calibration. We have aspects relevant as the level by which it is expected that the calibration occur. Now it is clear that no kind of type of strategies of downturn via portfolio analysis are possible. Expectations placed in this calibration are that granularity for deriving this LGD should be at the same level as the long run average, meaning if there is some kind of segmentation already defined at the long run average calibration, downturn should be at least at the same level, if not even granular. On top of that, LGDs that are derived by components, whenever calibration of downturn is done component by component also, it is expectation that the ECB is that the period that is more severe to the most relevant component is reflected as a minimum period for the aggregation process, meaning aggregation of the several components should not mask the severity of the downturn by trying to do some kind of compensation mechanism. Now focusing here in the slide, in terms of what is the reference value, what is new is not so much the technical specifications to derive the reference value, although there is news in what concerns the inclusion of open cases and some expectations on the level of granularity. Once more, putting the focus always in the calibration segment, but there is also the idea that we should not be including any MOC charge. Without any MOC charge, every calibration that have occurred until now, following strictly what were the guidelines for the downturn estimation, are now need to be revised, in the sense that it's not the same thing of comparing a reference value with an LGD prior to MOC than an LGD, of course, that is already adjusted for any uncertainty. In that sense, it's clear that banks needs to revise what were their previous conclusions in terms of reference value. Of course, this analysis may derive additional needs for increasing their LGD estimates. And please bear in mind that it is expectation from ECB that difference between the reference value and estimated LGDs only occur for one of two reasons. Or in one side, there is some kind of idiosyncratic event that may explain why the reference value is pointing to a different period, or there is clearly misplacement of the LGD downturn period, and in that sense, it needs for sure recalibration or at least some kind of MOC to cover any additional losses that are not properly reflected in the estimates. And with this, I will hand over to Khan.
Thank you, Jose. Can you move to the next slide? Thank you. I think the CCF component is basically posing us a number of questions, a number of difficulties, both at the calculation level as well as in the level of IT implementation. Let's start with the significant ones related to range of application. First of all, it's limited only to off-balance sheet items, credit cards, current accounts with overdrafts. There's a clear definition provided in the guideline for this. This is Article 166. And here we need to have flagging facilities for being eligible for CCF versus the guideline definition, obviously. There is a discussion of fixed CCF. There are situations where estimates of IRB CCF cannot be reliably measured or estimated, while reliable estimates are possible for IRB LGD. In the past, previously, this would have resulted that foundation IRB LGD values being used. Now I think you have the option to use your own estimates if you are able to essentially come up with properly measured LGD values by the book. And the guideline introduces the notion of minimum CCF value of 100%. So you don't necessarily need to anymore rely to foundation LGD values for such situations. According to CRR3 as well, it's already substantiated in that material, institutions should estimate and apply the CCF at single facility level, which would again causing some problems, especially for the cases where multiple products have been used and the bank in question doesn't have the one client view or the respective exposures. Here, the single realized CCF should be calculated for the combined off-balance sheet exposure. And institutions, banks should not apply the CCF parameter to the exposures that are not in the scope of IRB CCF framework. So basically, this is one area where a single facility from a risk management perspective needs to be created. That might cause a problem because currently a lot of banks don't use this approach. They basically have products that might not necessarily flow into the one facility definition, especially in the area of corporate asset class. This might be a bit problematic. Why do they become problematic? Because most banks have been building their PD and LGD models on counterparty level, on obligor level, and not on facility level. So the combination of facility level flags for the corporate and wholesale asset class, by and large, might be the next big problem issue. CCF also should be applied and estimated for fully drawn facilities, in addition to facilities with available exposure at the reference date. This is all well known, and that is coming along with the fact that we need to create the limit factor, which is defining as a drawn amount at the default moment in time as a percentage of the limit amount at the reference date. This should be as well probably available as an IT solution down the road. What are the data requirements? What is here relevant for us? Similar to the context of PD and LGD model development requirements, three data sets, three data structures have to be put in place for model development: the development sample, for testing data, for quantification sample. All information relating to modeling should be recorded and stored in one place, readily available, should there be a submission for the new model development, obviously. Here, there was a discussion as well about the appropriate risk drivers. If all relevant data, meaning like drivers, are properly available and stored, they need to have as well sufficient historical observation period, broad enough, covering as well the same type of, I would say, good bad year composition as is the case with the LGD. Here we see a very strong alliance with the LGD modeling concepts, and CCF in the guideline of EBA practically is a posture of a lot of resemblance we have to the LGD model development requirements. Formalized requirements are related to representativeness there. And there are some simplifications, example being they are less strict where representative issues are identified related to risk differentiation, most likely due to the fact that in the CCF modeling, we usually apply some business decision trees, and these business trees usually exclude the so-called outliers, and this might pose a kind of difference, a divergency from the LGD modeling concepts. And to account for this, I think such simplifications were pretty much needed, and they have going to be applied as well. Here, banks are more or less recommended to conduct an assessment how much effort they would need to have to implement changes on the modeling space and review the estimation frameworks for CCF. But we believe essentially for many banks that have been applying this facility level CCF estimation, this would lead to significant model redevelopment work because you have been only having product level CCFs, and now you have to combine different products, combine whole exposure at facility level, then it might be essentially meaning that you need to create complete new RDS, reference data sets. So you can't make the changes just by putting up there another layer of MOC. This will not work down the road. Yeah. If there are, sub-segment level portfolios not covered by the RDS, where future changes are expected, that needs to be as well taken into account. As I mentioned earlier, the rather clean solution under such circumstances would be, in most cases, creating a complete new RDS, taking into account the future expected changes, taking into account how product level changes would occur, and then creating a clean sheet to build upon the models rather than trying to amend here and there with multiple tricks and MOC if needed. In Article 182, CRR requires institutions to reflect reflect their modeling approaches, how changes in customer product mix affect exposure in RDS. They need to show this to the regulatory authorities, and any impact is either negligible or properly addressed in their estimates should be pronounced as well. They need to document the criteria for identification of the changes in customer product profile and consistency with which they will apply the definition by and large of facility, whatever facility means for the institution in question here. And here I think there are a couple of questions we need to take into account. Are the banks able to identify and link contracts replacing other contracts at the time of model development, take into account the reference data point? Are the banks able to link new contracts that are originated after the reference date to related contracts existing at the reference date? So there's this kind of time difference of accounting between the new contracts and old originated contracts. So that is also an issue. I'm not so sure how some institutions can handle it. What kind of solution, simply because they've never been exposed to such a situation. We are also aware of the main problem from a modeling perspective, and there's no one bad or no one good solution for that, the so-called fast defaults. I mean, we are told here, according to methodological guidance, that the calculation of the realized CCF will require to have the risk drivers used for the model development as of the reference date, which is to be fixed exactly 12 months before the default date. What happens? The default happens before the 12-month period, which we call sometimes the fast defaults. How should we handle these customers going into default not even after 12 months, not even at that moment, but earlier, like in the 6 months or 7 months? And this will need to be analyzed properly, because there's also guidance on this topic. If it's fraud related, then it should not necessarily be treated as a default, because fraud is not always a default. And if there's any other reason for technical defaults as well, they should be taken out from the sample. There is a discussion as well about the unadvised limit in the calculation of the denominator for the realized CCF. Obviously, we are assuming that the unadvised limit would be higher than the official limit. Wherever an unadvised limit is offered but not yet legally accepted by the obligor, but the obligor has the option to accept it any moment at his discretion or her discretion, the offered amount should be included in the CCF, which will be the detriment for a number of retail banks, because they have this unadvised limit already in place, and some of them for marketing purposes have been as well communicated to their client base or customer base. Here, obviously, assessment is needed for materiality of accounts with a zero limit, but greater than zero unadvised limit, obviously. There's also a question about incomplete observations, and this will be also a very interesting question from a modeling perspective, because this is relevant for portfolios where additional drawings are considered already in LGD and should be considered as well in the CCF modeling, in the estimation of CCF, as all CCF relevant defaults should be included in the modeling, and approach is required to estimate the future additional drawings. In parallel to LGD, I mean, it has to have a consistency with the LGD way of treating this additional drawings, which can be easily modeled for the retail portfolios, if there are sufficient observations, which there will be, obviously, the proposition should be as well to follow a modeling approach similar to the extent that LGD modeling has been done for such incomplete observations. Oh, there are a number of assumptions have to be made anyway, but the regression approach is here pretty much right in place. And to just determine the magnitude of drawings that are still expected to happen, expected to occur from all of those open cases. And I think this is a challenge going forward, because although we are pretty much forcefully told and advised to follow up everything what has been done already for LGD in the context of CCF modeling, there are some differences. We can't basically not oversee them. We should oversee, I mean, we should not be missing them. We should be looking into them. But this is a topic maybe for the future reference. Here, Robert, would you like to continue?
Yes, of course. Maybe let's go on to the next slide. So basically, just to kind of explain kind of what I'll be kind of talking through. Khan's been talking through some of the first section of some of the main changes, kind of giving a quick overview. I will finish that off, and then we have a couple of slides a little bit later on to talk a little bit more about maybe some of the of all these list of changes, what we see to be maybe the bigger ones, maybe the ones that you need to have a look at, or we certainly suggest maybe having a look at first. So with this section here on some of the changes in relation to risk differentiation. So the first one, we have region of instability. This is not necessarily a new change to analyze the region of instability. What has been kind of added here is essentially the option to for cases within the unstable region to use something called to use the same limit factor for overdrawn cases. Maybe just if I just take a quick step back. So region of instability, what we're talking about here is basically cases which are very close to their credit limit at the point of the reference date. So if you have a limit of €1,000, for example, and it's kind of €990, these very, very high cases, what they tend to exhibit when you look at sort of realized LGD are vastly positive or negative sort of swings. And if these cases are not properly kind of segmented, taken care of, then what they can do is they can kind of go into kind of different segments and kind of make modeling extremely difficult. So that's the background to this. And the change essentially is to give a few more options as to how you deal with this. The next case is called treatment of negative outcomes. This is kind of the terminology taken from the EBA. Really what this is from the CR3, that when you're calibrating CCF models, then before that is done, then there needs to be a flooring at 0 of realized CCF values. And really the option here is in the guidelines is really, okay, that can be done at risk differentiation as a building of sort of segments, or you can do that at risk quantification stage. And it gives the option. It says you can do either. You can do it in either way, and that, of course, then leads they need to explain which one you've chosen. So the recommendation here, or the thinking here, is to start to investigate that at the risk segmentation stage, to understand whether these cases can in fact contribute to a better model. So it's kind of like some of the things that you can start to look at. What is, if do risk drivers exist that would enable better segmentation? If they do exist, then there's an argument for doing that at the differentiation stage. If that doesn't exist and it's not really possible without a floor, then perhaps doing that at the calibration stages would be the preferable option. In terms of model testing, a lot of these requirements are really sort of built upon the PD and LGD requirements, as Khan was talking about before, and this is essentially kind of a similar example. There has been some slight expansions in this regard. There are some types of tests which are just not applicable for PD and LGD and only applicable for CCF. So those are the ones that are kind of that are coming in. So a particular case mentioned in the EB guide is relates to the previous topic, is where you calibrate your model, you need to make sure that your segmentation, so your segmentation is appropriately assigning these negative cases essentially to the lowest rating grades. That's one example, but there are some further examples. Maybe Khan, if you go to the next slide. And on this page, there are a couple of, I'd say, slightly smaller points in comparison to what we've spoken about before. One interesting change which we've seen in relation to the calibration to the long run average. At the minute, what's in this paper actually contradicts what's in the current ECB guide, where in order to calibrate at the level of a rating grade for CCF, what you need to do is take an average of every year's realized CCF and then kind of take the average of that. And that option has been removed in the current consultations. So we'll see if that remains, but that'll be one change from the current ECB guide. In terms of calibration, this has been more formalized in line with the PD LGD requirements. And in terms of downturn CCF, this is in fact an area, I think, due to the materiality, where there have been some slight simplifications to the approach. So once you've identified your sort of downturn years, there are normally a few different ways of kind of then working out what is the actual downturn LGD. So that the estimation approach, kind of using internal data, this mainly impacts that. Carl, if you can maybe move on one slide. CCF and default, this is also an interesting change. So this mainly, I'll cover this a little bit later on in the next slide, but this really impacts cases where models can essentially capture post-default additional drawings in a number of different ways. They can either, broadly speaking, capture those in CCF estimates or in LGD estimates. So in cases where that's captured in CCF estimates, then this becomes relevant to essentially try to build a model to estimate what could be the additional drawings on the defaulted portfolio. And basically the approach here would be to leverage the current approach for LGD. So you could use the existing LGD data set and to more or less follow a modeling approach very similar to LGD and default, but really just focusing in on the additional drawings. And then the final topic here relates to mock. So one of the main changes that we talked about briefly is this kind of like changing in the scope of CCF, where certain cases are kind of more are no longer eligible, and this would then become applicable there. So I'll cover that maybe on the next slide, where I think I can talk a little bit more in detail. Maybe if you just go forward one. Can I just go forward a slide? Okay, so I think in this section, I'll talk a little bit more in detail about, I'd say, some of the main changes that we've seen. So we've covered a lot of the changes of the past couple of slides, and one question we kind of get, okay, there are quite a few different changes, and which ones are kind of the big ones, which ones should we kind of focus on? So this kind of eligibility one is a fairly large one. Very simply put, there are certain types of facilities that in the past were eligible for CCF estimates, and they're no longer the case. And I would think about that broadly speaking in terms of any facilities which have kind of no end, kind of an open-ended facility, such as a typical credit card, they would remain. There are some other types of facilities which are more of a loan, but with kind of like a credit line for a while. So an example of that might be a loan to kind of maybe build a house, where for a period there is a kind of a credit line existing at the start of the loan, which would enable kind of additional drawdowns in the case of maybe a sort of unexpected expenses when perhaps building a house. So those sorts of cases are no longer eligible. So what does this really mean? If you have models or rating systems where this is the case, then in the future these will then need to come out of those rating systems. So what would that really mean? It could mean that there are difficulties essentially with passing sort of testing requirements, and the recommendation really is to understand what could you do to really understand to assess whether there would be a problem. So understanding, okay, using existing RDSs, you can kind of remove some cases remove these cases and understand what happens to discriminatory power, what happens to other parts of the facility. In terms of IT kind of changes, there are also some recommendation there to have a look at exactly what's going on, and really just to perform a review of what would be the impact without these cases. Would the models become feasible? What would need to happen? The next big change, which is on the next slide, this is the facility level application. So this is, I'd say, when you kind of look at the CRI, I wouldn't say it's necessarily super intuitive or what is really meant by this, but broadly speaking, you have sort of different accounts. You may have one client with multiple accounts, and if this client has multiple accounts or obligor has multiple accounts, and if they're more or less kind of managed together from like a risk management point of view, so maybe there's like an overriding or overarching kind of credit line on these sorts of accounts, and the bank may be able to kind of change limits, or maybe even the client may be able to change limits. Then those really should be seen as kind of like a single thing, and that's where that's kind of the background to this sort of definition of facility. Obviously, it's easier kind of saying at that level than kind of really establishing what exactly is the criteria for this. And that's kind of really what needs to really be done, is if this hasn't been done already, is to really establish what is the internal view of a facility. First of all, is kind of doing that kind of work, and then in terms of updating the RDS, that really then needs to start is to understand, okay, how does this impact the RDS? How do we what changes do we need to make? And maybe moving on to the next slide. Just a bit conscious of time. So fully drawn facilities. So you have usually, well, in the past you'd have for CCF models only facilities that have some sort of available credit at the reference date for these. This is then bringing in cases that at the reference date are already overdrawn. It's because it's been seen by the EBA, by the ECB, that there are some situations where even those cases at the point of default could have much higher EADs, and therefore the modelling of this needs to be captured. So an example of that might be if you're at the reference date, you over limit, and in the past would fall outside of the scope of CCF modelling. But maybe there's been an improvement, and the account comes back under its limit. Maybe 6 months down the line, a credit line increase, which then gets used, and then a default ensues. That's kind of like one quick example of cases which may fall into this, or the bank may just if over limit cases just end up increasing the limit. So really, these need to fall inside of the modelling process. It's not possible to calculate a traditional CCF for these. This is where this limit factor should be used. And in terms of things that can be done, I think most RDSs contain these cases already and probably get excluded quite early on in the modelling process. It's recommended to really have a look and to start to do the groundwork is what would it take to include these cases, not just from a modelling point of view, but and a process point of view, but also from an IT point of view. On to the next slide. So additional drawings, I mentioned this briefly before. So this really only impacts cases where these additional drawings, post-default additional drawings, are covered within the CCF estimates. And for banks which have chosen that approach in the past, then these two new requirements that then become relevant. So the first is called open cases. This is very similar to LGD, where for defaults that are currently open, there needs to be some sort of estimate or extrapolation to understand, okay, what could the future hold in terms of cash flows. That exercise would need to be done in order to kind of estimate for open cases what LGD would be, and for this a similar approach would need to be followed to try and predict, try and work out what would be the extent of additional drawings which should essentially be pulled into the realized CCF calculation. And again, I think I mentioned previously, same idea with defaulted cases. If additional drawings are possible for defaulted cases, then they need to be modeled. And the existing approach for LGD and default, the existing RDS, for the most part, with some minor changes, can be used for this. And then onto the final. Here's one more slide, Khan. If you just jump forward one. Yeah, and region of instability. So I mentioned this briefly before. This is not a new requirement to have the region of instability, but there are more options with dealing with cases inside the region of instability. Once you've identified these cases, generally speaking, you're talking about sort of low EAD, so fairly immaterial segments. So there's the option of using this kind of alternative measure of CCF for certain cases where that's listed on the right, where perhaps there are difficulties with various testing requirements where the region of instability is immaterial. So if you have had these problems, you've had these issues with cases in this region, then this could be something that could make life a little bit easier. I think with Khan, I think it might be the last slide, which would give us some time, I think.
Yeah, we are through the presentation material, but I think we had received a number of questions, and I think we need to really discuss them. I think one important question, this comes to the interest of Luis and Jose. Question is, can you please state the source that shows or indicates that the ECB EBA will review the permanent partial use minimum coverage and set new standards for it by mid-2028?
And so it's stated in the CR3, so Article 150, 2A, where it is stated that indeed it is up to EBA until July 2028 to publish guidelines on what they believe constitute exposures that are immaterial in terms of size and perceived risk profile. So basically, this immateriality needs to be tangible, and those guidelines are expected to define a threshold that will be on the quantifiable. That is our expectations, and because otherwise, on the qualitative manner, I think after 3 years we'll stay more or less on the same page. So it's already set in the CR3, and it's part of the EBA roadmap for the CR3 indeed to cover this dimension. Okay. So by that time, unless EBA does any kind of anticipation of their plans, which could be the case as we have seen on the CCFs, we need to wait a little bit longer to have this information, knowing that it's not, of course, adequate, considering that in many cases banks are closing their own planification of efforts, and this comes at the end. But basically, this was what was defined on the CR3. Okay.
Thanks a lot, Luis. I think I need to add one more important aspect to this. We have discussed this in the last webinar in the first half of the year. The ECB expectation is that at the time of application or new application for a whole asset class, you have to be at least covering that asset class 50% with IRB models, both PD and LGD if it's advanced, if it's not foundation, or with PD. And bear in mind, in the course of that period, which is a negotiable period, 2 years, 3 years, you should be bringing up this coverage ratio to 80%. The current understanding is, based on the past inspection that we have collected or received as input, that only 20% is ECB wants to have for that asset class being put under permanent partial use. I hope this is clear. This is a very important information. Okay, then we have the next question. I think I will try to address this with the help of Robert. Question is, am I or we are allowed to identify more than one bad year with a single economic indicator, or only one bad year for each economic indicator? Our experience is the following. You can use one macroeconomic factor or maybe two macroeconomic factors to identify a bad year. The reason is, why do we need to extend the historical observation? Because you might have a period of observation, say 10, 12, 14, 15 years, but this might only cover 2 bad years. But if you go back into the history longer time, deeper or longer, then you might be actually recovering more bad years. So you need to create a model. This is mostly a macroeconomic regression type of model, which goes back into history, where you identify more bad years to find out what is the actual good bad year balance in your composition. Okay, only one bad year for each economic indicator. That's not really what we have seen. I think you can use the same economic or macroeconomic variable to identify multiple bad years. At least in my experience, it was like that. Maybe Robert, you want to elaborate on this?
I don't have much to add on that. I mean, I think given the fact that we tend to see a combination of factors into this kind of model you're talking about, kind of adds strength to the fact that it doesn't really make sense to kind of say with one factor. You're not really using a factor necessarily to get to the bad years. You're usually combining factors anyway.
Yeah, but we have seen two-factor models. Very rarely we have seen three-factor, macro-factor models to identify bad years. Most banks still nowadays using one macro variable in their regression analysis to identify bad years, and they usually identify a threshold, and that threshold is the threshold to say if it goes above that, it's a bad year. They first of all look into their own existing observation period for which they have collected the reference data set, and then identify for the bad years that they think macroeconomically there was really a bad year, which is aligned with the World Bank understanding of a economic recession year, I would say, and then look at what is the average, observed default rate, and then look back in time when they're using this model. Whenever the historical observation would be expectedly higher above this threshold, and that year will be as well called this year as well called as a bad year. Sometimes this threshold, the question that came up right in the question, how do you set this threshold? This threshold can be used using some external references which are available for some countries like Italy, Greece, I don't know, Portugal maybe have this type of thing. But when you look to the TRIM guidelines, which I think some of you might have already read, in these guidelines you have been seeing some observed default years, observed bad years, and you can easily take the average observed default rates as this default rate. The problem will be this will be quite high in comparison to what you might have the last maybe 10 years. So you might never be reaching, when you go further back in time to this threshold. So the thresholds need to be sometimes adjusted by expert view. This is my view, by the way. But if you choose just the observed default rates from the economically or regulatory identified recession or bad year periods that is available in the TRIM guidelines, you might end up seeing no bad years as long as you might want to go back in time. So that's a problem you need to take into account. Another question came up. What are strategies to define a bad year for economic indicator? I tried to explain that. The bad years are bad years in terms of not just recession, macroeconomic recessions. That might happen, but the impact of that might happen in the next year too, in reality. So a bad year is from a perspective of modeling, from a modeling perspective, simply the year when you will observe higher percentages of default rates. And therefore, I think you need to bear in mind we're not looking here from an economic bad year. We're not looking into a year where economic variables are worsening or something like that. We are looking to the observed number of default years to identify the bad year. I think then we have another question. This question I think should be addressed by you, Robert. Question is, could you please elaborate a bit more on eligibility of CCF exposures? Are contingent liabilities in scope? Are BCE2 exposures supposed to get CCF estimates?
Yeah, I'll be honest, I'm not. I wouldn't say I'm an expert in detail on the background of some of these exposures, but really my understanding of what's there is there's more of a there's open-ended. The facility has to be an open-ended facility. So I'm just reading the question. So if this is a loan with a fixed term, then that would no longer be eligible for CCF. The way I understand it, generally speaking, is this is more of a shift towards kind of retail. So if you have these sorts of exposures, then really I'd focus in on this kind of definition. Is it an open-ended revolving product? That's my view.
I think the main challenge is here as well, to make sure that we can identify the revolving character, right? I mean, just to give you a counterexample, not sure if this is really an answer for this question. In the past, when we had undrawn portion of a credit facility for wholesale, and the undrawn portion had been always out there, but there was a maturity for the transaction. There was a maturity like 4 years, 5 years. This is not acceptable anymore. In the wholesale area, I think we do expect the most significant changes in the coming years, especially bearing in mind the fact that that the product level, wholesale product level features need to be adjusted to account for the revolving characteristics. If the revolving characteristics of a transaction has not been substantiated, that transaction cannot be accounted under CCF own estimation for modeling purposes. So it is essentially, the crucial question is essentially a very simple one. Do we have a revolving character or you don't have revolving character? If you look, I mean, the lady who posted this question might need to also bear in mind there might be contingent liabilities might be in scope or might not be in scope, as long as they fulfill this very fundamental observation. Are they revolving in nature, permanently revolving, or are they having a certain are they going to have a certain maturity? If they have a certain maturity, then they can't be revolving. If they are not revolving, they can't be accounted under the CCF. Yeah. Well, as expected, go ahead.
And also the amount used that could be repaid may no longer be available, which means that it's not fully revolving on both sides. So that's a complement.
Yeah. One other question came up related to installment loans. If again, the same answer I will give. The installment loans, as long as they have a fixed maturity or a maturity that might be revolved at a certain point in time, but at the time the contract has been signed, the installment loans have no contractual, I mean, if they have contractual maturity at the time of signature being signed, I mean, will be written, then in that case it will be not there have to be a CCF. It can't be a CCF based on own estimates. It has to be 100%. But the main problem for all industry that we see across different lobbying groups, as you might already know, there's a lobbying group called CRO. There are 11 banks, as far as I remember, last time I checked the account, and they're applying a certain lobbying activity, as are the major institutions in Europe, continental Europe. The major impact that they have been communicating would be for the fact the undrawn portion needs to be taken into account for capital charge purposes, and that will be increasing dramatically the level of capital requirements. For that reason, I think it's a problem. And also we had one more question. How sensitive should you be, or how do you set up the threshold? Threshold, I think, meaning like how to identify the bad year, I would expect. I tried to explain it a bit, but essentially it's a statistical exercise for the observation period and also for the period going back in time. And then you need to set up such a threshold where you would see like 4 or 5 times more default rates on a given year. And then it would be a bad year. Example, in Germany at least, when we look back, we really see increased default rates, not in the year necessarily 2007, but starting with 2008, 2009, and 2010, we had increased default rates, and then that decrease then significantly, both for the mid-cap, for the small and medium-sized enterprises segment in the corporate area. Similarly, for specialized lending, this is the year when we had significant defaults in the commercial property finance, in the shipping finance, etc. So basically, and that was very easy, but there are other countries where I can't be so comfortable to tell you that this will be very easy to identify, for the reason being the differences between good and bad years might be not so significant in terms of observed default rates. And there you need to apply some level of expert judgment and relying obviously on external benchmarks, relying obviously on your own internal data. Yeah, as expected came the fundamental question as well. Are we planning to share? Of course, we will share the presentation, and as well as we were recording this, and we will be sharing as well the recording with all of you. And should you have furthermore questions that you might not have been able to post on the chat board, or didn't have the time for that, or don't want to be sharing here, please feel free. You will get the email addresses with the presentations. You should ask, you should share the questions with us as much as you want. Last but not least, I think, please bear in mind, this CCF document is still a draft document. There will be a number of activities for certain adjustments, especially for the identification of product level mixture and inclusion in the CCF facility level calculation. We would expect still some lobbying activity being conducted on the part of larger financial institutions, which might felt that they might really beef up their capital levels, so they are trying to avoid this type of adjustments. But we will see that in the coming 2-3 months. But we personally, I mean, not personally me, but as PwC, we believe the document is to a large extent complete and also corresponds quite nicely with the CRR3. And for that reason, I think we believe there will be adjustments, not much in the document. So we do consider that quite a final version, what will come up as the CCF methodology for model development purposes. Luis, you want to add here something?
Yes. So we all know that with this new scope of application of the CCFs, internal estimates, we have most often a significant reduction, at least a clear reduction on the application scope. But we also need to consider that we still have, for instance, IFRS 9 models. So we need to understand for the future, if we have here relevant changes on the final quantification, how to translate those for the IFRS 9 context, and above all, if we want to cope or not with two methodologies in place for exposures that are in scope of the IRB and the exposures that are not in scope of the framework. So those are the decisions that I think many of us are still discussing with the clients, and I'm pretty sure we'll continue with those interactions in the upcoming months.
So I think we came to the end of our discussion and webinar today. There will be more webinars in the coming months. We'd like to discuss as well the ECB guideline relevant subtopics related to machine learning and related to some other IRB aspects of the document in the month November. A webinar relevant dial-in information will be provided through usual channels. Thanks a lot for participating today. Thank you for your attention and time.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.